Poppy Playtime Chapter 1 is a mediocre game. It's short, it fails to leverage its most unique ideas, and instead wastes them on boring, easy puzzles. The enemy, Huggy, while scary, is entirely predictable and essentially functions as a glorified timer. Yet, everyone goes absolutely nuts for this game, and I just don't understand why. Poppy Playtime is an indie horror game developed by Mob Games, with the first chapter having been released in October 2021. It was somewhat well received by the critical community. Many praised the game's story and aesthetics, though others criticized what they saw as a very short runtime and shallow gameplay. Regardless, the game was a hit, and it quickly gained popularity on platforms like YouTube and Twitch. Where Five Nights at Freddy's played on the uncanny creepiness of early 90s Chuck E. Cheese animatronics, Poppy Playtime distorts mid-80s to early 90s era children's cartoons. It is to shows like Sesame Street and Gumby what games like Bendy and the Ink Machine are to classic Max Fleischer animation. Poppy runs pretty far on its aesthetics alone. It's definitely a cool looking game. Huggy, the primary antagonist of the first chapter, has a really interesting design that juxtaposes aspects we recognize from children's toys with an incredibly threatening, menacing presence. Something about the design strikes us as incredibly unsettling, and it definitely succeeds in drawing a lot of attention to itself. When you first see Huggy, and inevitably give him a high five, you know he's gonna come for you at some point, but it's still really unsettling when you return to his room only to find that he has vanished. Add in the subtle music, the unsettling environment, and Poppy Playtime does a really great job of building tension. However, when you look at Poppy's actual gameplay, things don't really hold up. There are a lot of interesting ideas, and individually, each idea is executed quite well. The scenario is spooky and great for invoking tension. All of my coolest viewers subscribe, so if you want to be one of my coolest viewers... The dual hands mechanic shows a lot of promise. It could be a really great mechanism to integrate the precision gameplay popularized by Five Nights at Freddy's into a fully 3D first-person game. The chase and action sequences are really cool. They're highly scripted, but they're intense, they're cinematic, and they're fun. Unfortunately, Poppy Playtime fails to integrate these mechanics together in any cohesive way. There are segments that involve solving simple puzzles with the grabby hand. Some of these are interesting, and others less so. Regardless, you're never under any serious threat while solving these puzzles. Sure, Poppy pokes his head out of a vent and does a spooky thing here and there. He lurks behind some doors, but that's really it. Once you realize that Huggy isn't a threat, it becomes a lot easier to see what the gameplay actually is. A series of simple, mediocre puzzles. When you break it down, Huggy is essentially just an elaborate timer. His sequences are fully scripted, he takes the same actions every time, and there's really only a singular linear way to complete them. There's a glimpse of hope during the chapter's climax, where the player must use the grabby hands to pull a box down onto Huggy's head. This is the only substantial way that the player can interact with Huggy, and even then, it's still just a timer. You just pull the box onto Huggy. If you take too long, it's game over. Unfortunately, it's virtually impossible to actually fail this. You need to be blindfolded or something to screw this part up.
4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. What? 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 No!
The fact that AstralSpiff could beat Poppy Playtime blindfolded at all is incredibly impressive. Speedrunners generally don't do blindfolded runs of first-person games like this, and for a reason. It's incredibly difficult to develop normalized, repeatable strategies that rely on precise setups and sound cues. Also, if it wasn't obvious, Spiff has had his game modded to replace Huggy with Kermit, which is amazing. Make no mistake, Spiff's run is an incredible achievement. I certainly couldn't beat Poppy Playtime Chapter 1 blindfolded. Very few people could. However, I think it says a lot that it can even be done at all. To me, it kind of serves as an indicator that the game is ultimately pretty shallow. When I first played Poppy Playtime, I was excited. Not by Chapter 1, but by the promise of Poppy. I hoped that the first chapter would essentially serve as a playable teaser, a tutorial, and that subsequent chapters would better integrate the grabby hand puzzles with tense horror gameplay, and I'm still hopeful that that's the case. However, while doing research for this video, I brought these hopes up with AstralSpiff himself, and he was a little less optimistic than I was, saying that no, the rest will be more of the same. I followed the team making it, and they aren't big. Handful of dudes trying to make a functional game. I hope he's wrong, and that Poppy Playtime Chapter 2 does a really great job integrating the grabby hands into the action chase sequences. I hope it becomes the more modern, spiritual successor to the tense, high-precision gameplay of the classic Five Nights at Freddy's game. However, I suspect that Spiff may ultimately be right. Poppy Playtime is still a small indie game being developed by a small team. It isn't necessarily realistic to expect a small indie studio to constantly be doing groundbreaking, cutting-edge things. I don't think Poppy Playtime Chapter 1 is a very fun game. It's under 20 minutes long, long. It introduces a pretty unique mechanic, but only utilizes it for really simple, boring puzzles. Huggy, while scary, is entirely predictable and basically functions as a glorified timer. Is the story interesting? Sure. Am I curious to learn more? Absolutely. Is the setting cool? Definitely. However, I can get all of that stuff by watching streamers and Let's Players play the game. I can learn the details of the lore from MatPat's Inevitable Game Theory episode. I think it's really telling that the most interesting aspects of Poppy Playtime are completely segregated from its gameplay. You don't need to play it to get that. Thanks for watching.
Is there anything else you'd like to say, Poppy?
I'm a real girl, just like you.
What's the time?
Playtime!